when the senator gets here, his opening statement will be read into the record and we can continue, but I can start with my opening statement, and I'm very pleased to hold this hearing examining the many economic uses of the census and other federal data, particularly by U.S. businesses. Census data is the only source of objective and comprehensive data about the nation's demographic characteristics down to the neighborhood level. The decennial census provides the foundation for other federal surveys, including the American Community Survey. The ACS tracks social, demographic, economic, and housing data, including educational attainment, income and earnings, employment status, and housing value. Census data are an essential building block or benchmark for most nationally representative surveys, public and private, helping us to understand the economy, our workforce, and opportunities for growth. Businesses use census data to make economic and strategic decisions that determine the flow of almost $4 trillion in annual private investment. They use it to decide where to locate or expand operations, where to open new stores and distribution centers, even what products to sell in which stores. It affects where and how advertisers spend their dollars. When businesses plot their strategies, they look at census data to understand the skills of the workforce and the characteristics of potential customers. Let's take a few examples. David Kinney, the CEO of Nielsen, in a recent New York Times op-ed, described how businesses rely on census data to make a broad range of strategic decisions. The census is used to identify where, for example, to put power lines, cell towers, and hospitals. Target told us that the U.S. Census is one of many resources that it uses to better understand the communities where they do businesses. In the Seven Rivers region, which includes southwest Wisconsin, southwest Minnesota, and northeast Iowa, hundreds of businesses and community leaders are using census-based data to craft strategies to fill jobs and boost labor force participation. It starts with using data to understand who is unemployed, who has left the labor force, how much education have they attained, how do local workers compare to others nationwide, are they younger, older, more likely to be male or female. The strategies that emerge from a careful analysis of the data are varied. One approach is to expand childcare to make it more attractive for women with young children to enter the labor market. The Seven Rivers Alliance is just one example. Every day, companies across the country make decisions based on census data to chart their future. The decennial census is used to apportion representation in the United States House of Representatives and to determine allocation of federal funds. Hundreds of billions in federal dollars and fair political representation are on the table and depend on the census. Where we build roads, bridges, schools, and other core infrastructure is based on federal data. How we target funds to address cancer, obesity, and other health challenges depends on the census. Unfortunately, the 2020 census has been politicized through the citizenship question. Immigrant communities already skeptical of the federal government are reluctant to take part in a survey that they believe could be used against them, jeopardizing their status. A recent study at Harvard found that the citizenship question could lead to 6 million Hispanics missing from the count. That means Hispanics would be underrepresented in Congress and would receive less in federal dollars. It means businesses would not get accurate data about the role Latinos play in the U.S. economy. It means the 2020 census would not provide a fair and accurate count. The point of the census is to get a full count of the population. Any proposals that would limit or discourage participation would run counter to this very objective. This would undermine the integrity of the census data, inflicting substantial harm on businesses and others that depend on accurate data, and it would undermine the right of every American to be represented. Getting the count wrong would be costly with far-reaching effects on nearly every segment of the population and on nearly every industry in our economy. We would be misallocating resources through misguided business investments and poorly targeted government expenditures. We would be using flawed data on the basis for making and evaluating decisions, and we would be doing this for a decade. Accurately counting all of our people should not be a partisan issue. Businesses, researchers, policymakers, state and local governments all count on the data that flows from the census. We should all work to make it as accurate as possible. I look forward to the witnesses' testimony, and I'm so pleased to welcome the chair of the committee for his opening statement.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you, Vice Chair Maloney, for putting together this hearing on this important topic. Today, federal data and surveys provide the American people with a lot of information, including some invaluable information about our society and our economy. But there are two key categories of information that are currently absent from our federal surveys, categories that I'd like to highlight a little bit during today's hearing. First, our federal surveys, and in particular the American Community Survey, or ACS, and Current Population Survey, or CPS, fail to include information about past involvement with the criminal justice system. In other words, they do not tell us whether someone has been convicted of a crime, or has been put on probation or on parole, or whether they've been incarcerated at some point during their lives. Such data would, I believe, be invaluable for understanding how much these experiences might serve as a barrier to employment. For example, it would help us answer questions like how many people are out of the labor force because they have criminal records, and how does this vary in terms of geography, in terms of the geographic makeup, the demographic makeup of any particular community. In our own research on prime-age men who are out of the workforce, the JEC's Social Capital Project has found that 1/3 of these men have been incarcerated. And there's further evidence to suggest that men who are not employed are much more likely to have a criminal record than men who are. Indeed, we ought to have a fuller picture of this often forgotten segment of our population and figure out what we might do to help them, or what we might be doing to hinder them. What impacts our laws might be having on them that we're not aware of or that we didn't intend. Our goal should be to make sure that our criminal justice system is in fact just, that the punishment fits the crime and the criminal, being neither too lenient nor too harsh, and to help these men and women re-enter society and become productive members of their families and of their communities. That's precisely why I've worked with many of my colleagues on legislation to this end, legislation like the First Step Act, which was signed into law by the President after being passed by both houses of Congress in December, and which included some much-needed sentencing and prison reforms. Having complete data on these topics in our federal surveys would only further assist us in accomplishing these goals, these same goals set out and identified and passed into law in the First Step Act. Second, our surveys include limited information on social capital and on what we call associational life, which is arguably the most important factor in understanding our nation's health and happiness. The current population survey has included a few questions on social capital and associational life since 2002. But there's still a whole lot of information that's lacking that we don't even seek. For instance, it provides little information on trust or confidence in our institutions, especially local ones. It does not track loneliness, happiness, or the availability of emotional support. And it does not include information on the availability of public amenities like libraries, parks, and playgrounds, which have been shown to have a high correlation with things like community involvement. The CPS could, and I believe should, provide more information on the social integration that takes place between families, among friends, neighbors, congregants, and coworkers. And it could provide important details on the ways that technology hinders and helps social integration and interaction. Furthermore, having more social capital information in these surveys would help all of us, simply because, as research shows, strong social capital is conducive to finding and getting work. Learning this information would provide some missing pieces to a puzzle, giving us a clearer picture of ways we can strengthen our economy and help our citizens be happy and productive members of their communities. So I look forward to hearing our testimony from these witnesses today, and grateful that you'd be willing to join us. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you so much, and welcome to all of our panelists, and I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. Dr. Andrew Reamer is a research professor at George Washington Institute of Public Policy and George Washington University. He was formerly at the Brookings Institution. He provided an expert report in the New York versus Department of Commerce lawsuit and has previously testified before this committee. Dr. Reamer has 20 years of experience as a consultant in U.S. regional economic development. He received a PhD in economics development and public policy and a Master of City Planning from MIT and a Bachelor of Science in Economics at Wharton, University of Pennsylvania. He's a member of several federal advisory committees, including the National Advisory Committee on Innovation and Entrepreneurship and the Workforce Information Advisory Council. Mr. Howard Fienberg is Vice President of Advocacy at the Insights Association. In this role, he lobbies for the marketing research and data analytics industry, focusing primarily on consumer privacy and data security, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act tort reform, and the funding and integrity of the decennial census and the American Community Survey. He is the co-director of the Census Project, a 500-plus member coalition in support of a fair and accurate census, which advocated for uninterrupted funding for the census during the government shutdown. He has led other business groups to support funding for the decennial census. He has an MA in International Relations from the University of Essex in England and a BA Political Science from Trent University in Canada. Ms. Mallory Bateman is the State Data Center Coordinator and a research analyst at the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. The State Data Center is a partnership program between the states and the Census Bureau. As coordinator, Ms. Bateman utilizes her background in research, analysis, and public involvement to produce training and technical assistance based on data from the Census Bureau for the government researchers and community members. Prior to her time at the Institute, she worked as a research analyst at the Utah Foundation and researched a diverse range of topics, including demographics, voting policy, and local roads. She earned her BA in urban planning from the University of Utah and a Master of Science in social policy and planning from the London School of Economics. Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development, and more specifically on international security in the Korean Peninsula and Asia. Domestically, he focuses on poverty and social well-being. He is also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. He has a PhD in political economy and government, an MPA from the Kennedy School of Government, an AB from Harvard University. In addition, he holds a Master of Science from the London School of Economics. So I'd like to welcome all of you, and I thank you all for your testimony, and I look forward to your testimony today before us. And let's start with Dr. Reamer and go down the line.
Chairman Lee, Vice Chairman Maloney, and distinguished members of the Joint Economic Committee, I appreciate your invitation to speak today about the economic impacts of the 2020 census and the business uses of federal data. The widespread use of data derived from the decennial census by businesses and nonprofit organizations, workers and students, and federal, state, and local governments has a substantial positive effect on the vitality of the U.S. economy and the nation's 6 million private firms. Data sets from the decennial census are rarely used themselves in economic decisions. They're only gathered once a decade, and they only collect a few variables like age, sex, and race. But they're essential for economic decision-making because the decennial census provides the foundation for the development of three groups of federal data sets that guide public and private economic decision-making. The first group are the annual population estimates and the housing estimates, which are essentially updates of the data collected in the decennial census. The second group are household surveys, including, Mr. Lee noted, the American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, and the Consumer Expenditure Survey that collect data on variables that are not in the decennial census. And the third group are data-derived data sets that are geographic classifications, urban-rural classifications, and core-based statistical areas, all based on the decennial census. The vitality of the nation's economy and the 6 million businesses inside it are greatly affected by the decisions made by affected by decisions made using census-derived data by the businesses themselves, by the federal government, state and local governments, workers, and students. Businesses depend on census-derived data to determine whether to open a business establishment in a particular community based on market demand and the availability of qualified labor, where to site that establishment based on transportation and journey to work patterns, how large to make that establishment in terms of employment and capital investment, what goods and services to provide based on population size and characteristics, and once they're in business, what's their market share? What's their market penetration? The federal government uses census-derived data that affect the U.S. economy and businesses through 4 avenues. One is, as the Vice Chair mentioned, the census-derived data and determine apportionment and redistricting. Secondly, they determine economic indicators like CPI, gross domestic product, unemployment, and poverty rates. Third, again, as the Vice Chair mentioned, this federal government uses census-derived data to annually allocate over $900 billion geographically to cities and states across the country, 325 federal spending programs. And fourth, multiple agencies like FEMA and government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae use census-derived data to shape policies, programs, and plans that affect businesses. State and local governments also use census-derived data in multiple ways that affect businesses. They use data, again, as the U.S. government does, to draw legislative boundaries. They rely on these data to determine how best to deliver services, where to place schools, highways, and health clinics, how to design police patrols, and how to respond to natural disasters and other emergencies. State governments rely on census-derived data to project revenues and expenditures so they may balance their annual budgets. Half of the state governments use census-derived data to implement tax and expenditure limitations. Also, state agencies use census-derived data to direct federally funded subgrants to local governments, subgrants like Title I, WIOA, CDBG, and WIC. Finally, students and workers use census-derived data to make decisions that affect labor availability to businesses. Students choose careers and career pathways based on census-derived data, and workers use the data to determine where to look for a job and in which neighborhood to live. So in sum, economic policies and business decisions depend on the accuracy of the 2020 census. If full, accurate responses to the census are not forthcoming, the American economy and its businesses will suffer. Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, and committee members, thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I'm pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fienberg.
Chairman Lee, Vice Chair Maloney, and committee members, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today about the importance of the 2020 census to American businesses. Census data don't just underpin American democracy or guide federal spending, although those are important, but for us, they form the backbone of data-driven decision-making in the private sector. This data helps U.S. businesses promote economic development, identify and serve customers, and create jobs. I'm wearing 2 hats today at this hearing. The first is for the Insights Association, nonprofit association representing the marketing, research, and data analytics industry. Our members are the world's leading producers of intelligence, analytics, and insights, defining the needs, attitudes, and behaviors of consumers, organizations, and their employees, students, and citizens. With that essential understanding, a leader can make intelligent decisions and deploy strategies and tactics to build trust, inspire innovation, realize the full potential of individuals and teams, and successfully create and promote products, services, and ideas. Research studies in the U.S. require the most accurate decennial data in order to produce statistically representative samples of the U.S. population or segments thereof. Even the most essential federal government surveys, like the American Community Survey or ACS, formerly known as the census long form, are built on decennial census data. Without accurate census data, American businesses can't know what America needs. My second hat is co-director of the Census Project, a broad-based coalition of national, state, and local organizations and companies that support an inclusive and accurate 2020 census and ACS, including hundreds of state and local government groups, business trade associations, labor unions, academia, and civil rights activists. While the Census Bureau aims for 100% accounting of the US population every 10 years, it rarely achieves that goal. Hard-to-count populations in areas such as remote and rural areas, racial and ethnic minorities, young children, and low-income households are normally undercounted. But small inaccuracies in census data can have a big impact, especially in the business world, which is why Congress must fully fund the 2020 census as soon as possible. The census data explains more than just how many people live where, although that's an important aspect. Many companies, whether large multinationals or fledgling small businesses, will use the intricacies of census data to decide where, when, or if to site a business, find the right consumer base, discover and satisfy consumers' unmet needs and wants, identify and locate the best workforce to run their business or where the best workforce of the future may be coming from, take risks on up-and-coming neighborhoods, and discover locations with the right infrastructure and funding behind them. On the other side of the coin, economic development agencies like the Greater Houston Partnership utilize good, transparent census data at the neighborhood level to attract and retain business investment from around the world to their cities, based on labor data, education levels, and traffic patterns. Data-driven decisions are even more reliant on accurate census data when they involve smaller, hard-to-count demographic groups or areas. Starbucks can easily open another coffee shop in Manhattan's financial district, but it takes the most accurate census-based insights to justify one in rural Arkansas. Census data cover all American communities down to the neighborhood and census tract levels so that we can accurately compare an East Asian immigrant neighborhood in downtown New Orleans to a low-income Hispanic suburb of Austin and a mostly white middle-class small town in rural Washington. The trickle-down impact of an inaccurate 2020 census would restrain or ruin American businesses for a whole decade. For example, Utah-based Qualtrics, an Insights Association member providing software to measure and improve the customer experience for thousands of brands around the world, would struggle to provide those insights with the data and provide the data necessary for that experience, absent census benchmark statistical sampling. A utility company would not know where to site new cell towers, electric transmission lines, or water lines, so certain communities would go without enough coverage, while others might end up unnecessarily oversaturated. An obstetrics practice might not be open in an area growing dense with young family households if census data can't accurately reflect the neighborhood's demographic trends, costing the medical practice profits and the local community the benefits of care. A business might not invest in a certain neighborhood without special tax treatment for requisite concentrations of lower moderate income households, incentives that would be unavailable without accurate census data to qualify them. An Insights Association member conducting public opinion polling would not know how representative a survey's results of contentious political issues would be of the total population, let alone important demographic segments, leaving policymakers and stakeholders guessing. And Insights Association members measuring the US media audience and thus setting the rates for advertising, publication, and programming across the country would not be able to represent the whole audience without accurate census data, leading ad spending and media programming to target the wrong areas and demographic segments, miss others entirely, or not be produced and delivered at all. Finally, retail companies would be unable to conduct the extensive market analysis needed to accurately determine where, what, and when to build, nor be able to accurately forecast their sales, delineate trade areas, or manage their supply chain. The dependence on accurate census data of American businesses, especially the marketing research and data analytics industry, drives our advocacy for adequate resources for the Census Bureau. We're extremely concerned about cancellation of essential 2020 census field testing in remote and rural areas, potential drop in response rate due to the addition of a citizenship question, but also the general growing distrust in government, and the administration's plan to not spend all their available resources appropriated in FY19 in FY19. We're also worried about severe impact of a CR or shutdown heading into FY20 without a funding anomaly for the Census Bureau, since playing decennial census catch-up can be very challenging and extremely expensive. The Insights Association and Census Project also warned against sacrificing the ACS in any scramble for those decennial funds. Funding diversion would reduce the sample size, preventing the survey from delivering accurate data on more than 40% of US counties and small towns, mostly rural. For now, we're grateful House Appropriations today approved $7.5 billion for the 2020 census and $8.45 billion for the Census Bureau overall, in line with census stakeholders' request. The Insights Association and Census Project urge you to support the maximum amount of census funding to ensure an inclusive and accurate accounting of our nation's population and to help to determine the fate of American business for the next decade and beyond. Thank you for inviting my testimony this afternoon. I encourage you to peruse my written statement for a lot more examples, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bateman?
Chairman Lee, Vice Chair Maloney, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As mentioned, I work at the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah, and the Gardner Institute develops and shares economic, demographic, and public policy research that helps the public and decision makers make informed decisions in Utah. Also, I'm a member of the Census Bureau's State Data Center Steering Committee, a member of the Utah Complete Count Committee, and chair of the Gardner Institute 2020 Census Technical Advisory Committee. Utah's unique demographics and thriving economy provide insight into how important the 2020 census and other federal data are to the economic success of a state. In states with shifting demographics, decision makers cannot make wise and timely decisions to support and build flourishing communities without the decennial census and other federal data. Utah's 3.16 million residents have distinct demographics. We are the youngest state with the largest average household size, but we are following national trends of aging and diversifying racially, ethnically, and culturally. Utah's growth has been the fastest in the nation since 2010. Our strong job growth and broad industry growth attract new people to our state each year. Throughout the decade, migration has become a more significant component of our population growth, and in the past 5 years, we've added over 100,000 new residents because of net immigration. Additionally, new communities have emerged since 2010. In some areas, this means completely new investments in infrastructure, public safety, education, housing, and businesses. These areas have no baseline, so the 2020 census is the first opportunity to learn about the population. Some of Utah's rural areas have experienced population losses since 2010. While data from the American Community Survey provides us some insights to these changes, we need the 100% coverage provided by the 2020 census to more fully understand the changing demographics of these communities. The 2020 census and other federal data are paramount to our state, so we can understand the characteristics of new growth. Without it, we lack information about these new Utahns. The Utah State Data Center regularly handles requests for demographic information from the public sector, private industry, and citizens seeking to learn more about their communities or regions. The data provided help with decisions about programming, investments, business location, and future planning. I've been surprised to meet decision makers who believe that decennial data are only used by and for government. I work closely with our statewide Complete Count Committee co-chairs to maintain a constant narrative that decennial census data provides the baseline for myriad data sets and funding calculations across all industries and government. If funding calculations utilize a per capita measure or a sampling window based on a total population, it is highly likely decennial census data is the denominator. Our Director of Demographic Research, Dr. Pamela Perlich, likes to call our team the denominator people. Decennial census data is the baseline for the state and county level estimates and projections we produce, and those projections are a direct input for education, healthcare, transportation, and infrastructure planning efforts, which then turn into a significant investment at the state and local level. Utahns are recognizing the importance of a complete count from the 2020 census, and community leaders from nonprofits, community organizations, private industry, banking, and municipal government have partnered to urge state decision makers to support local outreach efforts this year. They emphasize the importance to a diverse array of interests, from economic development to health and safety of Utah residents. The state, cities, counties, and the state library are discussing various allocations to support a complete count in 2020. The work by Professor Reamer indicates that in fiscal year 2016, Utah received about $5.7 billion from census-guided funding programs. Calculations by our Utah Governor's Office of Management and Budget indicate that this was around 27% of the state budget in that time frame. These investments will pay for themselves quickly. We are reliant on a complete count of everyone in our state once, only once, and in the right place to provide us with an updated framework once a decade. We want to inform decision makers across agencies, organizations, and industries on who their constituents and customers are and plan appropriately in regions that may need additional assistance. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to a successful 2020 census.
Thank you, and Dr. Eberstadt.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee, distinguished co-panelists and guests, America's statistical agencies are the eyes and ears of our democracy. Whether you're a progressive or a conservative, in favor of more government or less, you need good data to inform your efforts to make our country better. For most of our history, the U.S. statistical system has been well ahead of the curve, if not a virtual wonder of the world. Recently, though, our federal information systems have not fully kept up with the social and economic changes they should be helping us monitor. They're currently incapable of providing key facts and figures we need for confronting some of our new and pressing domestic social troubles. In my book, Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, I tried to highlight the collapse of work for grown men in our country in recent decades. Although the employment situation for working-age U.S. men has been slowly improving, the latest BLS figures indicate that their employment rates are still just on par with the levels of 1939, as reported in 1940 census, which is to say, we still have a depression-scale problem on our hands. Our failure to cope more expeditiously with this problem may be partly related to the inadequacies of our statistical services to illuminate important dimensions of it. I highlighted a number of shortcomings and gaps in official information in that book I mentioned. Today, I wish to speak about just one of those gaps, but it's an enormous blind spot, and given the realities of life in our country today, a critical and inexplicable one. I refer to the virtual absence in our nation's statistical compendia of facts and figures about America's arrested and sentenced populations. These are large and growing populations, yet our government statistical systems can tell us almost nothing about them. The explosive surge in both arrests and felony sentencing in modern America is a fact of life. In 2016, 91 million Americans were included in the Interstate Identification Index, the database the FBI uses to determine whether someone has a criminal record. That's 2/5 of the adult population. What do we know about this huge contingent of people? Almost nothing. Age, sex, ethnicity, living arrangements, family situation, income, educational profile, health status, and all the rest of the data that the federal government collects on our population are not cross-referenced here. And the situation is even worse concerning the American felon population. It's not just that the government provides no information on the social, economic, or health conditions of these men and women. Astonishing as this may sound, the statistical system does not even offer an estimate for the total size of the population of Americans who have a felony conviction in their background. Academic researchers have attempted a demographic reconstruction, though. According to their estimates, this convicted population shot up from under 2 million persons in 1948 to nearly 20 million in 2010. By those numbers, roughly 1 in 12 American adults had a felony conviction in 2010, 1 in 8 adult men. That was 2010. Rough calculations suggest the total population with a felony conviction in America today might equal or exceed 24 million. We hear a lot about mass incarceration. Over 2 million persons in America are in correctional facilities today. Usually missing from the conversation about mass incarceration, however, is any recognition that these imprisoned Americans may represent less than 1/10 of the total population of felony convicts. Today, 20 million or more Americans not behind bars may have a felony conviction in their past. This immense population is effectively statistically invisible. The Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Centers for Disease Control, none can tell us practically anything about conditions of life for these tens of millions of Americans in our society. Needless to say, evidence-based policies to help reintegrate ex-cons and ex-felons back into the labor force and into families and into societies require evidence in the first place. We have a chance to end this statistical darkness, including just 1 or 2 questions on criminal justice system history in the ACS could end this statistical darkness. And linked administrative data offer another avenue for redressing this darkness with much greater speed and at far lower cost. For obvious reasons, approaches to reentry and rehabilitation today remain largely anecdotal. It's past time to take the steps necessary to begin resting our approaches to public policy in this realm on facts. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and Chairman. I'd like also, if I could, to add some additional materials to the record. With your
Absolutely. Thank you all for your testimony, and we appreciate your research and all your work in the area. I'd like to ask Mr. Fienberg about the addition of the citizenship question to the census and the effect that this will have on the accuracy of the data. We heard from all of you the importance of having accurate data, but we had a Supreme Court case recently that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Judge Furman in New York ruled that the addition was frivolous and a tremendous mistake and would lead to an undercount. 6 former heads of the Census Bureau, both Republican and Democratic, signed letters and spoke out that adding the citizenship question would result in an undercount. And we know how much businesses depend on this. The professionals at the Census Bureau also came out and spoke out against adding this question and said that it would result in inaccurate count and inaccurate data for the census, for the 2020 census. And in preparing for this, we spoke to Maureen Haver, a constituent of mine who's president and CEO of Haver Analytics. She's the premier provider of time series data for the global strategy and research community and maintains over 200 plus databases from over 1,000 government and private sources that rely on census data. She is concerned the citizenship question may reduce the quality of the census data. Reams of professionals have joined her in this decision. And Mr. Fienberg, do you and the businesses you've worked with share her concerns about the data accuracy of the 2020 census?
I do, and I should say I'm commenting in the capacity with the Insights Association hat on. Rather than the Census Project doesn't have a position on the citizenship question. The Insights Association does. We joined an amicus brief with a lot of other businesses to the Supreme Court case on this issue, and we do have a great concern. I can't tell you with any great certainty what the impact will be on a numbers basis. I don't think we have good enough data to be able to say, and that's part of the problem that we have going into this. But there's enough data to be able to justify that we expect there will be a significant drop in the self-response rate for the decennial, which is the people actually responding without us spending a significant amount of time and money to get them to respond. So even that alone, you can expect a significant increase in amount of money that's going to have to go towards non-response follow-up, which is the going door-to-door to get people to respond. And even if we're able to get the 100% accuracy at that point, that would still cost us an absolute fortune in non-response follow-up. But I don't think we're going to be able to achieve that because there will be some people that will still be deterred from responding based on the concerns about the citizenship question. That will trickle down into the data, just as the example I cited for the media measurement among my members, to be able to accurately measure the audience for advertising and programming among, say, Asian immigrants or the Hispanic population is going to drive advertising rates all over the map, and it's going to make everyone's spending in this area much less accurate, and there'll be a lot of wasted resources.
Well, there also, people feel that there'll be an undercount based on the political climate of fear, and that possibly that has increased the likelihood of an undercount. Dr. Reamer, I'd like to ask you about that. In fact, there was a hearing yesterday with the head of HUD, the secretary of HUD spoke, and he said that their policy would be to deport anyone in public housing and remove them from public housing if they were undocumented. Yet their children are citizens. As you know, if you have a child in America, they're considered an American citizen. So we could be facing a situation where parents could be leaving the country, but the children are staying here. And how are we going to take care of these children with the separation of the families? So when you read about this type of crackdown, it might have the effect on people of not wanting to answer the citizenship question, therefore not responding to the census. Do you think the climate for the 22 decennial census, which many have characterized as a climate of fear and uncertainty, presents a greater risk that we may see an undercount in 2020? And how do you think that would affect American businesses? And From all of your testimony, you cited the extent to which American businesses in the private sector rely on the census data.
The Census Bureau's own research shows that there is a climate of fear. They've held focus groups where people run out of the room, where then they're asked a citizenship question. The heart of the census research that was used in the citizenship case that both the plaintiffs and the defendants used was the Census Bureau's estimate that the non-response rate for households of non-citizens would be 5.8% less than the response rate for households with citizens. And the implications of that are, one, that a lot of people would be missed. As Howard says, there's non-response follow-up. Maybe in 2010, 65% of the people mailed back their form. This time they'll have.
So that'd be around 6 million people, the 5.8?
Yes,
That's a lot.
and the Census Bureau then has to find these people, and they don't always succeed. So the non-response follow-up leads to two outcomes. They either find them and get the information, or they don't find them and they know they're there, and so therefore they impute what they think the characteristics are, which may be wrong. So Howard's members may be, say, well, there's this many Hispanics in this community, but in fact it's 10% less or 10% more. And also, the Census Bureau misses people that they don't even know they miss. So
Regretfully, my time is up, and so I now recognize the chairman, Mr. Lee, for his 5 minutes, or 6 minutes, because I over.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Maloney. Ms. Bateman, I'd like to start with you, if we could. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the Census Bureau is really good at collecting a lot of information, but none of the Census Bureau surveys that I'm aware of has any measures for things like loneliness, happiness, the availability of sources of emotional support, nor do they, to my knowledge, have any information on the availability of public amenities, access to public parks, playgrounds, libraries, and so forth. And those are things that are often at least associated with high levels of community involvement. So first, do you believe that the addition of survey questions addressing some of these topics could help researchers better understand the health of civil society?
They could provide insight as long as people understand the concepts. I think there would have to be some explanation of what you're looking for. And I know that this is a topic that's coming up all over the globe, so you could probably find existing formats and surveys that could help provide guidance, but it would be an interesting thing to look into.
Right. It's certainly, even though it's difficult to measure, it's certainly not impossible to measure, right? There are ways you could devise questions that could at least allow us to get access to some of this information.
Other countries are definitely looking into this. So.
Are there any other topics that you would suggest trying to address in order to assess the health of our civic institutions or the health of civil society?
That's a big question. I think if you could have a survey that people felt safe and they trusted the institution in the first place to respond, you could extrapolate and add more questions touching on that type of topic, but it would require trust in the institution.
Yeah, sure. They've got to have trust in the institution. If they don't trust it, then you're not going to get as much of a response. But high response rates alone, if you're not asking the right data, won't give you that. It gives me some comfort to know that in other parts of the world, they track such information. So we know it's not impossible. We also know that it is desirable and that there are good things that could come from it. Sometimes we fail adequately to appreciate the impact our laws might have on relationships, on what brings people together as families, as neighborhoods, as communities, as fellow congregants, and so forth. Mr. Eberstadt, I'd like to ask you a couple questions if I could. We've found a limited number of relevant survey questions that deal with social capital. As we've undertaken the social capital project through the Joint Economic Committee, we've looked high and low for this. We haven't found a whole lot of it. And I think much of your work touches on things that are related to this. A web of relationships that connect people together that we have at the family level, at the community level, represent really, I think, what are people's best chances of succeeding in life, especially their best chances of thriving. What, if anything, would you recommend to be added to the Census Bureau surveys in order to give us a more accurate and fulsome view of associational life in America? Hit your red button if you
Senator,
can.
first and foremost, a salute to you and your committee for investigating this important question of social capital. I think your team has done great work, very promising work so far. I can mention one item in particular, which I believe you are currently prohibited from inquiring about, and this is the religious adherence or religious devotion of American citizens. Since 1976, the Census Bureau has been prohibited from asking such questions, and that has been taken, I think, broadly as best practice by all other statistical organizations. Since secular approaches and religiosity seem to have some bearing upon social capital, this would, I think, be a reasonable and maybe a very interesting question to include.
Thank you. Along with that, what do you think we ought to be asking about in terms of people's criminal records? The fact that, as much of your research indicates, there is a high connection between someone's criminal background, whether they've been on probation, parole, supervised release, or served time in prison, or all the above. Should we be asking more about that? And what could that tell us?
Sir, I think the most expeditious and inexpensive way of casting light in this area would be to link up existing administrative data with something like the current population survey, the monthly job report data. This could be done by the Census Bureau and other statistical U.S. authorities, paying attention to confidentiality and privacy of the individuals in question. This would be able to show, at least for a start, what sorts of patterns we see in the sentenced population currently on probation or on parole with respect to employment, income, family situation, and the CPS questions. It would probably take about 3 weeks to get information on those 5 or 6 million persons. Questions for the ACS, I think, would have to be tested very carefully and prepared very carefully, since this is such a sensitive and personal area of life. But if they could be adequately tested and rolled out, I think this would help to illuminate this darkness I was describing.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Vice Chair Maloney.
Thank you so much, and Representative Heck.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Dr. Reamer, listening with interest to a lot of the provocative dialogue here about adding additional questions for deeper information, but I want to step back and make sure I have this thing in correct perspective. As I read the Constitution, as I understand, it is not the first and foremost objective of the census to get an accurate count of the number of noses in America?
Yes.
Thank you. I've been doing and anything that would detract from that would therefore.
Yes.
Okay.
And if I could insert, and I'm happy to talk to members and staff afterwards, I have a bunch of ideas for how to collect the social capital and the population characteristics that would not involve adding questions to the census.
So I've been doing a fairly deep dive in the last few years on the issue of the crisis of soaring housing prices and the shortage of housing units available in America. We've compiled through our task force a report called Missing Millions of Homes. And for our conclusion that we are missing millions of homes, we utilized a lot of census data: housing vacancy survey, rental vacancy rate, home ownership rate, a joint HUD census effort on American Housing Survey, a building permit survey done by Census, and I could go on and on. I think, Mr. Fienberg, I want to direct this to you. We know that we're millions of homes short based on this data. But here's what we also know, which is that over the course of the last decade, there's been fairly flat funding for our efforts to collect this kind of data. And I'm asking you this because you made such a point of the importance to have robust funding for a totally accurate count. And I guess I want to ask you, as it relates to certain public policy challenges and social problems like the lack of housing units available, to what degree, even if you could describe this qualitatively, is our ability to understand these challenges hampered by a shortage of funding and complete accuracy?
I don't know how much funding is necessary for 100% accuracy. I wish I did. That'd be great to be able to
Are we
say
there?
Exactly. No, I think part of the problem is that Congress has to deal with a 10-year budget window for the decennial census, and it's very difficult for Congress to deal with that 10-year window when you're going year to year, and the Census Bureau starts out at the beginning of a decennial cycle at very little money, and then suddenly the last couple of years is spending in many billions of dollars and
Well, would you,
required to pull it off.
Mr. Fienberg, would you say that our ability to deal with these problems is in some fashion affected, if not curtailed, by an absence of having as accurate data as is reasonably possible?
Absolutely.
And this would include housing?
Oh, definitely. Yes. In fact, I would guide you towards a letter I referenced from the National Association of Realtors on how they use housing data to try to keep on top of the need for housing and the housing markets. And there's also extensive work done by the National Association of Home Builders using census data and trying to, again, impute into where housing is and where it should be.
Ergo, the need to provide adequate funding.
Absolutely.
So I want to shift to another kind of a parallel subject. One of the most fundamental and essential mandates that we've set for ourselves, I think, would be to maintain an economy in a state of maximum employment. And as a matter of fact, that's a statutory mandate of the Federal Reserve, price stability and full employment. Yet we can't seem to define full employment in statistical terms, or if we can't measure it. And I know this because we're currently at 3.6% unemployment, and the Fed has said full employment is 4.3% unemployment. And obviously, we're well past their definition of full employment, and yet, unless somebody informs me otherwise, the Phillips curve hasn't been repealed. We still are seeing modest wage growth, and we're still adding 150 to 250,000 jobs a month. So we're clearly not at full employment. I'm trying to sort out, is that because we're so far past the beginning of the decade that our data is fading, the accuracy of it? Is it because we haven't had adequate funding? But clearly there is a disconnect here. You're looking at one another like, not me, not me. Ms. Bateman, you. What accounts for this? Why is it that we are so far past the full employment data or target that they've set, and yet we're adding jobs? Dr. Reamer has an answer. Thank you, sir.
I don't know if it's an answer. I don't think it's the problem with the data. I think labor force participation rates are low historically. So what's happening is that additional people are joining the labor force. I think it is a question about why is it that unemployment is so low and yet inflation has not taken off and jobs are added.
You're saying the Phillips curve has been repealed.
Well, it may have been amended.
God wrote the Phillips curve, Dr. Reamer.
So I think it's a research question that it's not an issue with the age of the data. It's an issue with the dynamics of the workforce. And back to adequate funding, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is dying for adequate funding. They've been flatlined by Congress for the last 10 years, so their budget is 15 to 20% below what it was in 2010.
I think you've made my point. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Representative Schweikert.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Actually, to Mr. Heck, my understanding there's an entire group of PhD economists and demographers over at the Fed actually working on Phillips curve. Do you have to actually add in a conceptual shock absorber for potential labor force participation that we'd sort of written out, companies now being willing to hire felons, others, but also impacts of technology, changing productivity and other things. So there's always noise in the data. I have a dozen things here, and I want to disclose in a previous life I lived in Tiger files. So I'm sort of from that in a previous life. For those of us from Utah, Texas, Arizona, where we have quickly growing substantial population movements and shifts, I understand the 10-year census with as many questions as possible for businesses and economic decision-making. But for communities like mine, we look dramatically different than we did 10 years ago. If every day I'm getting 300-400 new residents in my state. If we do the 10-year census, is there a elegant way to start doing what a lot of my businesses, my universities, even my state government is trying to look at, and that's ways to almost crowdsource much more living data? If that makes sense, how do we look at every day, how many building permits, birth rates, deaths, everything else, but you also actually even start to look into how many gallons of fuel sold, how many of this, how many of that. Are we basically still living in a data design model that's decades out of date? And you think about everything from social indicators of how many people signed up for SNAP this week to how many people we believe picked up a job or this and that. There's got to be a way that when I'm looking at my community, I'm not looking at data that's 10 years old. And I mean, we're living in a time where we're walking around with supercomputers. I'm frustrated, and it's somewhere here there may actually be, and forgive my heresy, a data modeling opportunity between government, university, census, business, to build as a model. And why this is so important is I want to know, is what I'm seeing in the Tiger files, in the U6 data real? Am I really seeing those with personal issues moving into the labor force? Am I really seeing millennial women moving in, but not millennial males? And is that living data is the type of thing we could also be, as we're doing policy every day, be reacting to? And in some ways, I know I don't have a classic demographer on the panel, but let's do a little bouncing. Because maybe being from sort of the university mechanism, is what I'm speaking heresy?
I don't know that it's heresy, but our team would advocate to look to your research universities. Our team produces an annual update to estimates and population projections, and also looks at housing units in the state. We have a database where all the local cities report their building permits to our database. So we have these ongoing partnerships with the community to keep an up-to-date data set.
Dr. Epstein.
Sir, what you say is music to my ears. I'd love to hear that.
Oh, God, I'm the least musical person you're ever going to meet.
Well, let me give it a try.
But I would love at some point to say, and I actually have read your book.
So, big data, linked administrative data, and other census data, which are indispensable, all wonderful opportunities. With respect to U6 and to the Phillips curve, the Humphrey Hawkins Act was written at a time when working age men were either
Can I beg of us not to go there? I know exactly where you're going, and actually, I'm not a big data person. I'm now moved to crowdsourced data. I actually believe big data gets old very fast. Living data is more useful. Dr. Reamer?
3 points. One is the Census Bureau produces annual population estimates that are very good. If the census is accurate, The bulk of the update annual is based on records, births, deaths, and tax forms, where people move from one year to another. So in terms of the actual head count, it's pretty good. I think what would be helpful is, one, getting a contingent work supplement on the CPS so you understand that aspect of the workforce. And secondly, Vice Chair Maloney mentioned Maureen Haver. She and I are working to create the third annual conference that brings together statistical agencies with Amazon and Uber.
And something like that, I would love it. Please forgive me, Ms. Maloney, just one quick, being someone that also spent a bunch of time bathing in the community survey, I actually have to disagree with you on just something. I think actually distrust of government, there was some academic research out there that was a bigger fragility in return rates than citizenship or all the other things that were being sort of discussed and tested. So we may actually, I know one is a political hot potato and fits the, us against them, but we may actually have a whole cultural thing we have to work through, because that was one of the real problems on the community survey research. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, and we've been joined by Representative Beyer from Virginia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's my first time in this room finding a button. Thank you very much for being here. First, Dr. Reamer, my daughter just graduated with her MPA from GW Friday morning, so thank you. She seems thrilled to have it, and now all she needs is a job, and things will be good. So.
My mother graduated from the University of Washington.
Wow.
Just from Mr. Hex.
It's the 1 degree of separation. So, yeah. And I really want to thank you all for talking to us about the business uses of the census data. When I opened a Land Rover dealership 22 years ago, we went months without selling a Range Rover until I turned to the census data and figured out where our customers lived, where our potential customers lived, and all of a sudden worked out really well. And the biggest concern that we have in my district right now throughout Northern Virginia is the fear of undercounting. And so we obviously have a sadly divisive political climate. The meeting at the White House this morning is the latest example. Has that dampened businesses' willingness to advocate for the census and participate in census research? All the controversy over, for example, the citizenship question, or just
Will the gentleman yield for 2 seconds?
Yes.
You're raising a really important point. We had difficulty getting business representatives to come, which we've never had before. We had the Chamber of Commerce in prior years, and some of these men. Nielsen wrote a big report, and yet they said they didn't want to come because of the divisions and the fight over the citizenship question and the divisions between Congress. So that's a very important point that you raised. Thank you for raising it.
From the positions that you have you seen any reluctance on the part of businesses to be part of this?
I have, and certainly we're used to a lot greater participation from the business community and advocacy for the census, and in case that I'm not, things I'm not directly involved in, but in the preparation for the decennial, businesses play a huge role in helping to get out the count, getting people involved, making sure that both people, companies' employees and their customers are going to be getting out and know that the decennial census is coming, making sure that they're going to self-respond. It's hugely important. A lot of them are not getting involved this time around. A lot of them are a little bit showing hesitancy on getting involved in presentation and advocacy, on all sides because of the citizenship question. And that's not a specific thing saying that they're opposed to the citizenship question. I think the average business, and most businesses, don't have a position on it one way or another. They are risk averse and don't want to be involved in a political controversy, period. So there are some companies that will care deeply about it because of the impact on the data that they're going to rely on, but most are more concerned about being involved in a political controversy and being seen as taking a side on a political issue.
Yeah. So I don't know if this is Ms. Bateman or Mr. Fienberg. I know you've been pressing for full funding of the census, but one of the things that's concerned me is the dramatic reduction in the number of people that are intended to be hired from the 2010 census. And I know that what I read is that supposedly the technology is so much better that we don't need to have all these people working the streets. But do you have concerns that there aren't going to be enough human beings knocking on doors for the people that didn't mail it in or go online? Ms. Bateman?
Yes.
Okay.
I know, especially in Utah, we do have very low unemployment, and that wasn't the case in 2010. And so specifically in our case, I know that our partnership specialists and partnership team is trying to start very early to try to get people on board and trying to reach out to different groups than they had in the past, trying to figure out jobs where people might have more flexible hours that they could find, like the opportunity for a second job would be appealing. But I know that our low unemployment in Utah is definitely a concern.
And if I recall correctly, there was supposed to be, according to the Census Bureau, they were going to be aiming for 1,500 partnership staff out they're going to be sending out into the field. According to the GAO, they're not likely to hit that this year in terms of their hiring, and you need to hire them now. Admittedly, in 2010, I believe they were closer to 4,000 partnership staff, and it's a huge deal in a very large country, especially as you move west in the country, when going door to door and making contact with people in remote areas is extremely complicated. And again, in a condition where the government is not trusted, you need to have people out in the field setting up relationships with the local church, with local community groups, with local trusted entities to make sure that there is someone other than just the government knocking on the door saying they're there to help.
Dr. Reamer, I only have a couple of seconds left, but I'm fascinated by not just big data, but by the progress we've made on machine learning and deep analytics. Will this census be able to be used in very different, more important ways because of that evolution?
I think so. So both coming in and going out, right? That kind of machine learning and high-tech computing will be used to produce a more accurate census, and then going out, the capacity to match for the Census Bureau to get administrative records, to get private sector records, match them up with census records, and do modeling, I think would be a new frontier for us.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Much Representative Marchant. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Co-Chair. I'm from a very high-growth district and state, so, and from a background of being a mayor and in the state legislature. So we have depended on the Census Bureau giving us more frequent updates than every 10 years. So that data we rely on much more than we do the every 10-year data, except for the reproportionment of our congressional seats and then the funding issue. My question to you is, after all of the public policy is taken into consideration and the census is actually done, and then you go through this very delicate process at the end of the census where you have this undercount adjustment that takes place. And I'd like to know your opinion of how much the undercount adjustment actually erodes some of the information that's in the report itself. And if you have a citizenship question, which we are concerned about in Texas as well, because we want every nose counted, period. Because so much of our funding for our cities and counties, school districts, depends on it. And of course, the number of seats we have in Congress depends on it. How will there be an adjustment to the census, in your opinion, based on a question that they think, or the general opinion is that there's a possibility that this question could suppress the number? Will there be an adjustment for the undercount Or will there just be a general readjustment of the definition of undercount? And I know that's a really a question that doesn't get asked very often, but I think that this may be the first time in many, many decades that the undercount may be one of the most political things that happens as a result of this census. You take a stab at it.
Congressman, my understanding is that there is no adjustment. So whatever the count is, that's the count. And that was a Supreme Court ruling of 20 years ago, that because in the 90s, the Clinton administration proposed to adjust, because in 1990, 5 out of 100 African Americans and 5 out of 100 Hispanics were missed. So that was the proposal, and the Supreme Court ruled, no, you have to use the actual count. So there's no adjustment of the count is the count.
Yes.
But after the count is what's called a post-enumeration survey, which tries to measure census coverage. In other words, census goes back a year after it went into the field and said, how well did we do? And so you can go online. I'm happy to give you the web for the nation, for every state, for every county above 100,000 or 200,000 people. There is an estimate of census coverage measurement. How many people were accurately counted? There are a lot of duplications. 3 out of 100 people are counted twice. 3 out of 100 people are missed. So they cancel each other out. And so there is a one-page chart for counties in the Dallas area or wherever for that. And the same thing will happen in 2020. So people can look and see how well did the Census Bureau do. There is a breakout for the nation by race, ethnicity, age. So they do a retrospective, but the count itself is not adjusted.
Yeah, but in the state legislatures and their process of redistricting, those states that have that process, they wait for that information to come out many times to seriously get down to the actual drawing. And so my question is, to reiterate, Texas, the fast-growing states want the most accurate census. They want every nose counted. I know that Utah does and Texas does. So I'm interested in that policy question. I'm also interested in Mr. Eberstadt's point about felons. Now, your definition is not felon. Your definition is someone that has experience with the criminal justice system.
Yes, sir. I referred to 2 separate populations. One was in the III, people who have a criminal record that can be accessed through the FBI or through police authorities. That's one group. The second group is people who at some point in their life history had been convicted of a felony, of a serious crime punishable by a year or more in prison.
I'm over my time, but do you think there's a possibility that if a question is put on there that is not asked properly, it could actually have an effect on who is willing to respond to the census?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Has to be.
Thank you.
Woman Beatty.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank my colleague over there. It was a perfect segue for me to not just ask you, Dr. Eberstadt, but the rest of the panel. I want to take special note to being very interested in your testimony and to emphasize for the record that some of the information presented in your written testimony, especially the chart we have, indicated that Black men who were out of the labor workforce at a higher rate than their counterparts, even though maybe they had a lower interaction with the criminal justice center, maybe where my colleague was going, but you were very specific here. I suggest that this might also be an economic issue worthy of a fuller examination beyond the census for this body to take a look at, since we're talking about economic development. But I'd like to focus more on your position that we need more information about persons with a criminal history. So what I'd like to pose the question to the entire panel, do you have concerns that the inclusion of a question about a person's possible criminal history might affect the participation of the census or the accuracy of the data?
It's a critical question, and it's a very sensitive question that one would be asking people. It would have to be tested very carefully. It would have to be rolled out in a very careful way so as to ensure that this did not adversely affect participation in the ACS or in other surveys where it might be asked. We have a way of test piloting this investigation that wouldn't have any effect on non-response rates, and that would be by linking up existing administrative data on probation and parole with proper privacy and confidentiality controls to the existing data coming out of our monthly jobs report, out of our current population survey. That way, all of the data would come from administrative sources already, and it would be possible to get a sense of how much of an impact sentencing has on.
Would anybody else like to make a comment? And maybe while you're thinking, I want to go to you, Mr. Is it Fienberg? Research shows us that asking stigmatizing and sensitive questions such as citizenship status might lead us to reduce rates of some community wanting to fully and fairly and accurately be counted in a census. So I'm concerned about the unprecedented politicizing of the 2020 census if such citizenship questions are the first step down a very troubling path. Like, how would it affect the integrity of the census and the federal statistics based on the census if we were to ask questions that residents might not want to answer fully or may be fearful that responding? For example, have you ever been a victim of domestic violence? Or have you ever been incarcerated? How would that affect the business participation in the census? And that's you, and then anyone else quickly, because we only have a minute.
I'm not sure about business participation specifically. I know that it's certainly a lot of different questions. They do carry a stigma and concern for folks. I think the idea of putting those kind of questions on the decennial is questionable at best, because you are trying to focus just on the head count. But certainly those questions are asked across a lot of federal surveys, and to Dr. Eberstadt's point, administrative data is a very good way to start in trying to get a better picture on a lot of those topics.
Well, and let me tell you why I say not only businesses, you know the reasons that the census are used. It was articulated before, if it's for the reapportionment board and drawing the lines, it's for how federal dollars come back into the community. There's a whole host of reasons, and so maybe I should do a little cultural thing here. I can tell you coming up that there were days when the person would come along and ask very personal questions. My father would not answer them because he felt that it was going to have some type of indication with the IRS, or somebody was going to come and start doing another investigation. I don't really believe in this wonderful America that we live in that things have changed so much, as we still have not been able to reform immigration reform. We still need to reform our criminal justice system. So I know my time has run out, but I think we need to take a look at this. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think, because there have been federal studies, that people are going to open their doors automatically to give you the answers you want. Thank you, Ranking Member.
I want to thank all of my colleagues for participating today, and our distinguished panel and our panel of expert testimony. And as we've heard this afternoon, businesses, researchers, policymakers, and communities across the country count on a fair and accurate census to make a broad range of economic and strategic decisions. We must do everything possible to ensure that the 2020 census is accurate. The record will remain open for 7 business days for any member who wishes to submit a statement or additional questions. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you all very much. Thank you.